the best place to start is to talk about the beginnings of Christianity, Jesus, and how this relates to the Jewish community of the area in the first century. Before I begin, just one other caveat. Beginnings of Christianity, there are two terms that I'm going to avoid using today: Old Testament, New Testament. The reason I'm going to avoid them is that these terms are not neutral terms. I would say they are theologically charged terms. They reflect a specifically Christian point of view. Testament, does anyone know what the word testament means? Testament is another word for revelation. So Old Testament, New Testament means the old revelation and the new revelation. So from a Christian point of view, Old Testament refers to the Hebrew Bible, and the testament in question is what was revealed by God to Moses and the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. That's the old revelation from a Christian point of view. The New Testament refers to that which was revealed by Christ. It has a connotation of old and antiquated testament versus new and improved testament. So instead of these two terms, we use the word Hebrew Bible instead of Old Testament, because it's more descriptive and not, judgmental. And instead of New Testament, we say Christian Bible. Now, when we look at the beginnings of the Christian attitude towards Jews, we're going to look at it from 3 points of view. First, we're going to look at it from a theological point of view. What does Christian dogma, Christian doctrine, Christian teaching say about Jews? How does it instruct Christians to think about Jews? So first is the theological. Second is the political. In other words, what was the political status of Jews in Christian states? Third is how did ordinary Christians see Jews? Now there's overlap between these three, but these are three different points of view. So let's study the beginning of Christianity and the life of Jesus. We immediately have a problem, and oftentimes in the case of great orators, great charismatic individuals, he never wrote anything down. There's no book written by Jesus. There's no scroll written by himself. So what we know about him are and about his teachings, are things that other people attributed to him. Problem number two is, even among those things that others attributed to him, none of them are contemporary to Jesus himself. Jesus died in 32 CE. When I say CE, to avoid a theologically charged term, CE means Common Era, which is the same as AD, which is Latin for Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, which makes perfect sense for Christians, but for the rest of us, when I say CE, same as AD. So, Jesus died in the 30s CE. The earliest writing about Jesus was 30 years later. The Gospel of Mark is the earliest of the Christian Gospels, and the author of that Gospel did not know Jesus personally. What he's writing down is something he heard from someone who had heard it from Jesus. So there are no first-hand accounts. The next problem is, the accounts that we have are inherently biased. Either they're written by the followers of Jesus, those who believed that he was the Messiah, the Son of God, that he had been resurrected, all of that, or they were written by those who rejected him. No impartial sources. So that's the other problem. Now you might think Jesus lived in the Roman world. Maybe the Romans, who were neutral in all of this, or at least semi-neutral, maybe they can lend some information about this. Turns out not so much. The earliest Roman document about Jesus is from the 130 CE. There's no reference or mention to Jesus in any Roman document until 100 years after his death. And this is remarkable because the Romans, administratively, bureaucratically, were so anal retentive. They wrote everything down about everything, but nothing about Jesus, which tells us that it's possible in the first century he just wasn't as big a deal among the Romans as he's been made out to be. Maybe. Now, the closest thing we have, an unbiased account, are the writings of a first century CE historian whose name was Josephus Flavius. Now, Josephus, we would call him a Roman Jewish historian. He was closely connected to the Jewish community of first century Israel, but he also was very much part of Roman culture. If you read the first history of the Jews from biblical antiquity until the first century, he also describes the different groups of Jews in the first century, and he is the first to mention the Christians, the followers of Jesus, as a community. Now, how did he describe Jesus? First of all, he described Jesus as a Hebrew or Jewish prophet. He also describes Jesus as the Messiah of the Jews. So that is a very loaded term. Jesus as Messiah eventually came to mean for Christians is not what it meant to Jews in the first century. The word Messiah comes from a Hebrew word, Mashiach, the anointed one. In the ancient Jewish world, basically two positions that were anointed. Kings, like King David was anointed, King Solomon was anointed, and the high priest in the temple in Jerusalem was anointed. So in this case, referring to the Messiah as the anointed one, referred to a Jewish belief that eventually the Jews would be redeemed from foreign rule by a descendant of King David, the founder of that great Davidic monarchy, the kingdom of David and Solomon. And that descendant would appear and be anointed and simply become king of Israel, and that's pretty much it. The Jewish notion of the Messiah, of the Mashiach, was simply a return of kingship and political independence. Now, for Christians, it took on that much more cosmological dimension. And eventually for Jews too, the concept of the Messiah became not only the Redeemer of Israel, the people, but also about the redemption of humanity, world peace and all that. But when Josephus refers to Jesus as the Messiah, he simply says, this might be that descendant of King David who is going to restore political independence to the Jews. The problem with Josephus is he's not entirely reliable, because in the first century, what they called historians is not what we think of as historians, to record the events of the past as faithfully as possible. Now, they had that type of person in the ancient world, but that person wasn't called a historian. That person was called a chronicler. So there were Roman chronicles which basically said, this is what happened this year. Put it this way. A historian like Josephus wasn't someone who was going to let a few facts spoil a good story. He embellishes like crazy. He's also writing both for a Jewish audience and for a Roman audience. In any case, we have this mishmash of semi-reliable stories about the life of Jesus and the beginnings of Christianity. So what we as historians do is we take them all, problematic sources, we lump them all together, and from that we try to construct the most reliable story that we can. We do our best. And to their credit, historians of Christianity, I think, have done a great job. They use certain criteria to make sure they were doing away with or vetting as much of the bias as possible. One they call the criterion of multiple attestation. Whatever fact or story you're hearing it from two independent sources. Something which only comes from one source is assumed to be maybe not believable. And when I say two sources, it can't come from two books of the gospel, because the later ones are built, that's the same source. That's basically one just repeating the other. But if something about Jesus is mentioned in a Christian source, and something about Jesus is also mentioned in a Jewish source, that's not quoting the Christian Bible, that's assumed to be true. The second criteria, plausibility. Something is described which defies our sense of what's naturally possible, probably not true unless there's other evidence. So when it says Jesus walked on water, because we don't have any corroborating scientific evidence that that's possible, we look at such stories with a degree of skepticism. Okay, if archaeologists found evidence that it was possible, fantastic, we're scientists. And the third criterion, I think this is the most interesting one. This is called the criterion of dissimilarity. If there's something about the early Christianity which differs from what Christians later came to believe, it's assumed to be true. Why would they include it in the story? In the Christian Bible, there are really two versions as to where Jesus was born. One is Bethlehem, one is Nazareth. You have the story of the birth of Jesus in the manger in Bethlehem, but he's called Jesus of Nazareth. So based on the criterion of dissimilarity, which of these makes more sense? And here's how it works. Later, Christians came to see Jesus as a descendant of King David, creating the notion that Jesus was a messianic figure. If you're a descendant of King David, it's more likely you were the Messiah. David had no connection to Nazareth. So any source which indicates that Jesus was from Nazareth meets the criterion of dissimilarity, because why would they mention Nazareth as a place where he was from if it doesn't affirm his Davidic pedigree? Christians needed to see Jesus as a descendant of David. That's how the Gospel of Matthew begins. It traces Jesus' lineage back to King David. It seems less plausible. It's more like something that they would make up in order to sort of give Jesus a better pedigree. Having him from Nazareth doesn't help him at all. It's the greatest town in the world. Today it's very nice. Back in those days it was sort of this remote Galilean town out of the way, lots of corrupt Romans living there. Not a great place. Bethlehem, always a very nice place. In the first century, in the land of Israel, Jesus was part of the Jewish community. He was born Jewish, there was no question. All of his disciples were Jewish. But saying someone was Jewish in the first century CE is more complicated than this. There were 3 or 4 different ways to be Jewish. Now, for a long time, historians refer to these different ways as sects of Judaism. Distinct Jewish communities. The first one to refer to these groups of Jews as sects was Josephus, writing in Greek. Translated as doesn't really mean sect. It actually means philosophy or mentality. So really, when we talk about different kinds of Jews, we're talking about different Jewish mentalities or outlooks. The reason that's significant is because sect is a sense of very, very strong boundaries between groups, like you're one or the other. In fact, for first century Jews, it was a big mishmash. There were these different, Jewish schools of thought, or Jewish mentalities, or Jewish outlooks, and most Jews would kind of pick and choose between them. The 2 largest of these mentalities, these groups, one was known as the Pharisees, the other was the Sadducees. Now, they were different in certain ways. The Pharisees was the largest of these groups. In fact, Jesus was born into a family of Pharisees. What distinguished the Pharisees from the other groups of Jews in the first century, apart from the Hebrew Bible, written scripture, over the centuries, the Pharisees as a group had evolved an additional corpus of laws and beliefs and customs based on the Hebrew Bible. This came to be known as, in Hebrew it was called Torah Shebe'al Peh, which in English means the oral law. And it wasn't written down until the year 200 CE, but it was transmitted from teacher to student, from master to disciple. And it was in this transmission of this oral tradition that was the core of the Pharisees' belief, where the Pharisees eventually got their alternate name, the rabbis. These are the intellectual precursors to the rabbis. Now, rabbis today, this is the principal clergy in the Jewish community, comes from a Hebrew word, harveh or rabbin, which means many or great or master and apprentice. The rabbis became the bearers and the interpreters of this oral tradition of laws. Eventually, this version of Judaism won out. The Sadducees were largely drawn from the temple priesthood, and when the temple was destroyed, they basically ceased to exist. They were assimilated into the Pharisees. But here's the point. Here's the important point: is the Pharisees were the largest first century group of Jews. And in the first century, eventually, their principal rivals were Christians. And this is why, in terms of characterizing that original relationship between Jews and Christians in the first century, one historian recently described the relationship between the rabbis and the Christians as, he used a biblical metaphor, Rebekah's children.